I want to talk a little bit about ease and easeful living and insourcing versus outsourcing. Insourcing versus outsourcing awareness, attention, and wisdom, something like that. All right, we're here, we're going. So I want to start with this. I've been listening to Alan Watts, who died, I believe, in I think he died the year I was born, 1973. And I've been listening to him a lot. He was a philosopher, scholar of Zen, of Taoism, and of Buddhism and Hinduism, including yoga. So his breadth of understanding Eastern wisdom traditions is broad and deep. He's kind of a scholar academic type. He had a radio show in the 60s. There's probably some people here that used to listen to him in the 60s. I would guess there's a few people in this community that fall into that category. So anyways, I've been listening to him a lot lately, and this really caught my attention. This most people walk around in constant opposition to themselves. Most people walk around in constant opposition to themselves, which when he's saying most people, I always put myself in that category. Like, I don't think I'm that different, right? Than most people. And when we look at like the core of like, why is this? And what is the cost? Like, what is the cost of that? What is the cost of living in constant opposition to ourselves? And how might that show up? So what I want you to do now, and you can just do this on a separate little list where you have your paper or pad or whatever you write on, is like, how have I been in opposition to myself in the last 24 hours? Like just maybe you had to go to the bathroom and you stayed at your desk for another hour. It can be the little things, like maybe it can just be the littlest things. Like maybe you just needed a break to do nothing, and instead you picked up your phone. It can be like, I wanted to say this in a conversation, but I held my tongue because I didn't want to stir the pot, or vice versa. Maybe I put my foot in my mouth again in the same way I normally put my foot in my mouth. Because being able to self-identify is where we can make change. And so it's not to self-berate, like that's not the idea here, is to beat yourself up. The idea is to become more aware of your awareness itself and to be able to identify behaviors or where you're taking action that's in opposition. Now, the more subtle your awareness is, and that happens, I find through work. I find that happens through work. It happens through practice. It's very seldom either your parents did the work or the people that raised you did the work, and you had that as a benefit. So it was more easily available, but still there's going to be a level of work to it in general. So the more subtle your awareness is, the more subtly you're going to notice how you're in opposition to yourself, right? And so you can use that as another trigger of even maybe, like I was talking to someone yesterday and she entertains doubt. Doubt is very toxic to the self. It's toxic to the immune system, right? Just on a basic cellular level, it destroys the identity of self from not self, which helps identify viruses, bacteria, pathogens. So even that, I'm like, if you can look at the level of mind or the level of awareness of like, where have I been in an opposition to myself? So what I'm finding more and more is that because our awareness is moving outward mostly, right? Like how many people, if you look at, like, this is a way of noticing this, like how much time did you spend looking at a screen this week versus looking at the sky? It's kind of wild, right? Because you think like 100 years ago and there was like a lot of sky gazing happening, right? There was a lot happening that was actually attuning us to the nature of our nature. and part of the problem with outsourcing, and when we outsource our attention as our go-to, so we wake up in the morning, we pick up the phone and we check a bunch of things, and usually checking a bunch of things is taking a lot of input in from other people, things that other people have posted, messages other people have sent, data sets, et cetera. It's like it's outside of the self, and it sets a pattern for the day of looking outward. It overrides the natural arising intelligence of the cosmos that's within the vibratory space. So that's going to sound like really like new age gobbledygook, right? Unless you've had the experience of it, and then you're like, yeah, that's right. Like more or less. It's in the ballpark. So then the question is like, what does it look like? What does your week look like when you attune to being, rather than in opposition to yourself, when you really look at like being in cooperation or collaboration or in a state of non-separation? So right now I'm building a new course, The Simple Detox, and I'm building it for a few reasons. I've learned a lot over time. And one of the things that I found is this outsource versus insource is really, it gets very triggered in detox. Because people are like, what should I eat? What should I do? People will often go into like an alert mode rather than to a relaxed mode, because there's like change, and people are used to doing things often that are more from a place of willpower rather than from a place of acquiescence, especially things like detox. But it's in the acquiescence. I see it more and more. It's like you probably all are seeing this with the habits more and more. It's like the habits start to do themselves. And the more the habits do themselves, the more time you seem to have, the more power with your awareness you seem to have, the simpler, the more important things in life get. And the more like the distraction falls away, and the more the opposition to what the body needs, what the mind needs, that starts to fall away. It just it seems to just get digested in the process of attuning. So anything that is really coming from the nature of the intelligence of the cosmos and the rhythm of the cosmos, including the rhythm of human beings on planet Earth, anything that's like in that, if we tune inward, tune awareness into like the rhythm's already happening, right? And collaboration with the rhythm is your natural state, because you are the rhythm. There's no separation between the self and the rhythm. It's the rhythm that is you, that created you. There was this other thing Watts said, let me find it. He said, this was interesting. This was he pulled this out of the Bible. So Jesus says, I am the way. And Alan Watts is like, they just dropped a verb in there. It's I am is the way. So in your very I amness is the intelligence of rhythm. And the more you like tune in instead of tuning out, right? The more you're able to notice what's already arising, you fall into rhythm. And we find this with the habits a lot. Like one of the powers that Andy's describing here is like, wow, the power of the community living these habits, that it's easier to do it. It's easier to fall into it, to the momentum. But it's even easier too if we notice that like, well, the rhythm's already in us. Like I am the rhythm. I am is the rhythm, right? Like it's already in there. So what happens is processes naturally occur. So detox is a naturally arising process. It's part of the rhythm. And the reason I'm using detox as an example is because I'm building that course right now, and I'm trying to find the easiest way, which is really hard. It's really hard. Like, I'm like trying to not make it any harder than it is. And like doubt will creep in, and I'm like, no, that's in direct opposition. Like that's in opposition. I have enough experience to trust insight and to just move from that place. So as we notice, the habits start to take over, right? The rhythm starts to become more of our natural state. With that, we notice more what we want to do, and we're more able to just do that without doubt, without needing to talk to a friend about it, without needing to consult an expert about what I should eat or not eat, about what time I should, I mean, any of it, like any of the things, right? Any of these things that we tend to outsource, what supplements I should take, what I should do. We start to tune awareness in. So it's like any question in the next week that you find yourself asking outside of yourself, see if you've already asked yourself inside of yourself. And then see if you've acted on that answer. Because some of us are good at asking and receiving, but then not acting in alignment. So then again, we're in opposition. Like we're kind of getting like partway there, but then not all the way. So then the question is like, why are we afraid to insource wisdom rather than outsource wisdom? What are we afraid we might be missing out on? What is there basic underlying distrust? Or is there an unexplored territory that just seems numb or blocked? Or just, I mean, numb is kind of when you're not aware of something, right? Where you kind of just lose awareness, where it's just like, I don't know how, like these gateways, these pathways aren't established. So it just goes nowhere. It just feels like a cloud or a fog or a brick wall. It can be like that if we've outsourced so much. And I've seen this a lot in the last couple of decades of working with people. Some people have outsourced their wisdom so much. And this is where you get quotes like Alan Watts. Most people walk around in constant opposition to themselves. They've outsourced so much that to insource, there's not an established, it's more or less like, say you're trying to go into the jungle. If anyone's ever done hiking in the jungle and there's no paths, because awareness hasn't created the pathways inward into the subtler awareness system. It's like the jungle seems like a wall. And you just can't get in and you can't get through. So, but that's okay. Like that's where you start exploring. Like you start checking it out. You start checking, and then you notice like, oh, there's kind of a natural little pathway in here between these, this mangrove trees. And there's like, it's a little easier to get in. And then you kind of start edging around in there and moving your awareness around in there. And then certain things give way. And soon you have a pathway. So the more developed those pathways get, that's the subtle body awakening. And I was talking with a friend last night whose parents are from India, Brahmin caste, like, a couple generations back. Like there's a lot of those inroads in his awareness, but he was raised totally Western. And we were talking about, and he's a physiotherapist or physical therapist, and his brother's an MD. And so there's like a lot of medicine in their Western medicine and allopathy in the family. And we were trying to have this conversation about these maps, because if the jungle has maps, like you've not only walked the territory, or others have walked the territory, but there's maps. Right. So if you haven't walked the territory but there's like, here's the map of the jungle, like the easiest way to start to get through, and some of the brush to clear on these trails that are naturally part of your physiology. It just makes it a lot easier. And then you can say like, oh, I'm over here now. I'm over in this, I'm in this experience. And then I can have a conversation with someone else who knows the territory and knows how to speak of the territory from the landmarks on the map. You can have a really different kind of a conversation. And you can have more of an experience of the territory, which is the point of the conversation. And that, all of that, I would say, the more we look at collaboration with self and falling into the rhythm or falling into the self, that it's gravitational, that it's there. So it just takes a redirection of awareness from outsourcing to insourcing. What I want you all to start to notice is what gets triggered Is it trust? Is it like, how does it show up? Is there a level of trust? Is there a level of doubt? Is there a level of distraction? Is there a level of numbness or confusion? Is there, I mean, for me, if I look at it, it's like, there's just a lot of distraction these days, right? A lot of distraction, and it's juicy distraction. It's like really enticing distraction. So to even just see that pattern of like, oh, that's opposition. Okay. But like, what is it? What I'm curious about is like, as you notice where you're in opposition, these little micro ways throughout the day, where you're in opposition to the self, where you're in opposition to your body, to your mind, to your intuition, find out why. Like, find out a little bit about the trigger that pushes you into outsourcing action and outsourcing attention and outsourcing wisdom rather than insourcing. Just start to like play with it, start to notice it. Because the more you can notice it and name it, then you can see it a mile away. It's like, oh, it's coming around the corner. There's distraction. My mind had this idea to like pick up my phone or whatever. Or, I mean, those of you who are working with multiple apps to bounce around. Like, you're in this app, say you're in the Facebook app, and then you're in the Slack app, and then you're in the Google app, and then you're in, whatever. Today, I mean, I maybe have 7 apps open. And if I bounce around, you can spend a lot of time doing that, right? And not do the thing intuition was guiding you to do in a coherent, streamlined experience that is the experience of you as the creator. That is the I am is the way. It's an expression of the I amness, right? Of like doing the thing.
Hey, podcast listeners. Have you been feeling tired, overwhelmed, anxious, or like your body and mind just feel stuck? Well, twice per year, we gather as a community for a 3-week yogi detox, a perfect chance for you to reset your system and clear out the seasonal buildup of physical, mental, and emotional toxins. We trade recipes and tips, and we keep each other accountable. We all know that detoxing with friends is way easier than going it alone. So check out yogidetox.com for your next chance to clear out old patterns and awaken your inner wisdom. We can't wait to see you there.
All right.
I just want to respond to one thing that you said about like bouncing between the apps, because I actually, for the first time, it sounds so silly, but like I felt like the fatigue of flipping between tabs when I was being productive. It was like, oh, do I want to like scroll over to this tab, copy paste this thing? Because I'm not used to like being in rhythm of flow, like when I'm working, but it was so silly because like, what energy does it take me to scroll my mouse up, flip over to a tab, copy and paste? But I literally felt this like, oh, that's work. Like that's hard. And I don't know, like I'm trying to create this rhythm for productivity right now that's like really showing up in a challenging way. So your question about like this insourcing, like I need to stop insourcing to the old self, because like the old self is telling me to, like, cravings are still coming up in a big way. And I just wondered if you could speak about that too. Like why cravings just seem so like, so convincing sometimes, like more convincing than, deeper wisdom or truer self in source. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that matter consciousness, space consciousness, that part. So matter consciousness. So what we've been taught, this conversation so far has really been on space consciousness. Like when you're more aware of presence than thinking, right? So even like being in presence, which is easeful living. It's where you're in the experience of yourself as the cosmos, right? And presence is the experience of it. And the vibration, it's really fascinating to me how that's what builds the immune system, right? Like such a buzzword in 2020, right? It's like that's what builds that, is that ability to just to be. And it is an act, but it's also occurring, but it's an action if you're not in it to move awareness into it. So that matter consciousness is when we're focused on thoughts and we believe thoughts. So like the woman I was talking to yesterday, she had a lot of doubt. Like it seemed like a bit like at war. It's like a Bhagavad Gita type of a war. There's a lot of these like stories about of this direct opposition that Patrick's talking about, where you have like basically the potentiality is at war with conditioning, right? So conditioning is the past self, and it has a weight to it. It has a weight of all the prior actions. Now, anyone who's working, any of the yoga health coaches who's working with addiction and identity, like it's hard. Like if someone's been a smoker or someone's been a drinker, like their entire social structure is tied to that addiction. And there's good parts of that too. Like that's where they get love, like that's where they get someone who picks up the phone or whatnot. Like there's a level of connectivity that's arising in that, but it's pathological to the potentiality. And so because, I mean, to me, it's interesting. Like I do believe that we can drop past conditioning really fast. Like I do think that it can be like that. It can be a spontaneous awakening where you're just like, enough of the bullshit. I think what can happen, it's when you've had it up to here and you just are like, you know what, I'm more into what could be. And sometimes that could take someone decades to do that, but it might not, right? Like Siddhartha nailed that at what, in his 30s? So there's stories of where people are just like, I need to make a break. I need to make a total break from the conditioned self. So we know that's possible historically. I mean, it's in our world traditions. We also know that ritual and ceremony are really important for as accelerators. If we can't just like make a decision to be like, okay, enough of matter consciousness, this and conditioned self and all my relationships that are tied to that conditioning and all the foods and all the substances and all the distractions and all the habits that are tied to that conditioning. That's where ritual comes in. So Chip Conley said something around, let me see if I can find it. Chip Conley was, he was a businessman in the boutique hotel industry. And then he helped the guys, the founders at Airbnb really take Airbnb and like launch that to the next level. And he's one of these guys where you're like, oh, and he did this other thing too. He wrote a book called Emotional Equations, which, has anyone read Emotional Equations? So that guy's mind, so fascinating. So what he said, let me find it. The more digital we get, the more ritual we need. That's one to like write down and put on the bathroom mirror. Like the more, because you can just take we out, put I in there. The more digital I get, the more ritual I need. And so what I'm finding with these habits and what we're doing in here together is we're tuning to the same rituals. And because we're doing it as a group, there's an ease because of all those things I mentioned before with like relationships and support and the sense of belonging, which is the natural state of unity consciousness, right? Which is the opposite of ego consciousness in a way. It's one of the opposites, you could say. So ritual, this is kind of where I was going with what I'll be talking about in Simple Detox is like, that's a ritual. It's a seasonal ritual. It falls under the category in Ayurveda of Ritucharya. What we do in Body Thrive falls under the category of Dinacharya, of daily rituals. So if anyone did breath body practices this morning, it's like, that was a ritual. That was a ritual. If anyone scraped their tongue this morning, that was a ritual. If anyone rubbed oil on their skin and really massaged their skin, you know, one of the benefits of self-massage I learned about way later in the game was that it releases hormones that are trapped in the skin that regulate the endocrine system. Do you guys know that one? That sounds good. Like if anyone's having any sort of endocrine imbalance, there's, right, which is what, blood sugar, right? Hormones, sex hormones, stress hormones, things like metabolic hormones like thyroid. It's so fascinating. You're releasing, and then what happens is a sense of self-regulation. That's a ritual. Doing self-massage over decades. Who here's done self-massage for at least a decade, like more or less daily? Yeah. Right. It's a ritualized part, and it gets so ritualized. It's hard to imagine why someone wouldn't do that. Like, it gets really hard to imagine, like, what would happen if I couldn't rub my hands all over my body, right? Like, that would be a very, very different experience of having a body. And the same thing's true when we look at, what the ritual of preparing for sleep, the ritual of sleep, and then the ritual of arising. And to me, these basic dinacharya habits, they're like how to fall into the ritual of daily living, knowing that we need it more than ever. When I started learning this stuff, like I'm trying to think what my digital life was. So it would have been the 90s. My family started emailing really early, and I was doing internet research by 95 for work. That was my job for an environmental nonprofit. But I would say capacity wise, like that, it was such a small part of my life, even though it was my work and it was the way my family was communicating, compared to now, where all my relationships happen through this, to a very, and as a way of meeting up, a lot of it is like a way of like getting together. So when we look at this of like, so these little nice habits from Ayurveda, these habits of yogis, dinacharya, are they're a lifeline right now. And if you see it as a lifeline into ritual, and then you practice the rituals, like you're doing it as ritual. And what's interesting about ritual is it occupies 100% of attention. Like when done right, it's all that you're doing when you're doing it. You're just doing it. And that is where you start to insource more. Because when you're doing it, you'll be in a different vibrational experience of you'll be in space, you'll be more tuned into space consciousness. Which means the conditioned self that Patrick was pointing to, that conditioned self is less, it's less sticky. It's less of a draw to your attention. The cravings are less, sticky to me is such a good word. It's like just less grabby or sticky or pulling at awareness, because the rituals are attuning to space consciousness. And if awareness can only do one thing at a time, you're in parasympathetic instead of sympathetic. You're in the experience of it, and you'll have then different thoughts and ideas and impulses, or the experience of deep peace. If you're in the space between. All right. So that's more or less what I wanted to talk about today. Insourcing versus outsourcing, and why, like, for us to just really investigate this with, again, both Chip Conley, but also Alan Watts. Like, what if we are not in opposition? Like, what is then the experience of being you?